In the initial part of developing this book, I was asking myself this question here, and it's like, why do I want to write a book about functional programming in Scala? And just that simple question led me to develop my own goals for the book. And then what you see here ended up becoming my soft goals for the book, which are also going to be, of course, the soft goals for this video course. The first goal is to introduce functional programming in what I think is a simple way, but also a thorough way. And I want it to be just like you and I are having a conversation or we're sitting together and doing some pair programming. Second, I can't emphasize enough what the world was like in roughly 2015 to 2017 when I was creating this book. And that is that it was really hard to find a good, complete course that taught functional programming in a systematic way. So that's what I wanted to do here. As I mentioned in other videos, I created a lot of notes during my process of learning functional programming. And then when I got to the end where I was like, oh, okay, I finally understand all this, I came back and I organized all my notes and I said, well, you have to learn A before you can learn B, then you have to learn B before you can learn C, and so on. So that's the way this book and this video course is organized. I think it's also important whenever you're learning anything, you want to understand both the motivation and the benefits of what it is you're learning. So in this case, you want to learn the benefits of functional programming. And especially in small examples, it's not always clear why some things are better in functional programming. And that's because it's really hard to write a small functional programming application and see any benefits compared to other ways of programming, procedural programming, for instance. And that's because of all the things that we do to protect ourselves. But what happens in larger applications is all those things we do to protect ourselves add up. And it makes the larger applications easier, even though it seems like smaller ones are like, gosh, why are you doing all these things? So I'll talk about that as well. Because it helps see the big picture, I also provide several small but complete functional programming example applications in this video series, and we'll be looking at those as we go along. Another note was I wanted to save you the time and effort of having to learn Haskell like I did in order to learn functional programming. And that's not to say anything bad about Haskell. It's actually really, really helpful for me to learn Haskell and then come to Scala. Because again, if you think about the years 2015 through 2017, when I was writing this book, functional programming in Scala was really in a transition. So it was nice for me to be able to go to a language like Haskell and say, oh, okay, this is the reason they do things the way they do. Because in Haskell, you can't write OOP code. That's one thing I should mention too, is when you look at Haskell, it's like the only way you can write is with FP. And so then things became more clear. Oh, okay. Even though functional programming in Scala was in flux in 2015 through 2017, I could look at Haskell and say, okay, this is why we're doing things the way we're doing them. And then the sixth point is that I want to help you learn how to think in functional programming. And I'll talk about that more in just a few moments. In general, another thing I want to do is I want to help you start writing functional programming code without having to learn a lot of mathematics, by which I mean category theory and background theory and technical jargon, like I show in this figure right here. So if I had a time machine that could take you back to when I was writing this book, a lot of these terms were just being thrown around, and it was almost like you were expected to know these things. And in fact, most of us don't know them unless you were taking functional programming courses in college. So I began to refer to this as the functional programming terminology barrier, and I'll talk about that in a future video. So in general, I won't talk about technical jargon unless it's necessary, and in some cases, I'll show something and I'll show how to code in a certain way. And then I'll say, oh, by the way, what I just covered was an ADT, or something like, oh, what we just did, that was a monad, by the way. So I'll typically only use these terms after I show you what they are. Another thing I want to note here is there is a bit of a learning cliff involved in functional programming. So when I first took thermodynamics in college, I learned this quote that I shared at the beginning of the chapter, and that is, one learns by doing the thing. And what I mean by that is college was really easy for me until I got to this thermodynamics class. And it was a night class, and the teacher wasn't very good. So I stopped going to the class and I just tried to learn by reading the book. And this was one of the first things that for me that was really hard. And it was like, okay, Al, you have to start doing these exercises. The only way you're going to learn this is by doing the exercises. And another time when this came around was roughly the year 2009. And I started working with Drupal at that time, which is a content management system. I can't remember who created this image. I note that here, but they note that the learning curve for content management systems is usually anything like these three lines here, whereas Drupal starts off higher and then it goes this way, and then you start going backwards, and people fall off this learning cliff. And then if you get up here, you're going to be in really, really good shape. But you can see all the effort that was required to get up here. So that's why they call this the Drupal learning cliff, because unfortunately, a lot of people didn't make it up this curve right there. So I'll say two things about this learning cliff. And number one was I found that diagram actually to be very accurate. And then number two, learning Drupal was probably one of the most beneficial things I've ever done for my brain and for my career. So even though learning Drupal was difficult, it ended up being a terrific investment of my time. Everything I learned about proper system design and architecture, maybe even a few things about database design, were all significant. And I don't have any regrets about the time it took me to get up here and across over here. So similarly, in functional programming, I had a really similar problem that I had with Drupal. And it's like you get to a certain point where it feels like you have to know or learn many different things simultaneously. The thing I would add to that is nobody tells you the proper order. Oh, you need to know this one before you can know this one. And then also, it's easy to take accidental and incorrect detours on the learning path. And that was especially true back in the day when I was trying to read random blog posts or watch videos. So what happens when you're looking at these random blog posts and videos is people just aren't teaching in a consistent style. So one person is saying one thing, another person is saying another thing. Turns out they might be saying exactly the same thing using different words, but their examples are different, and everything was just inconsistent. And again, there was no organization to things back in the day, and that's where this book came in. And I think that's one of the things that helped make this book really successful back in the day was just trying to organize things and introduce them in the right order. Another interesting thing, and I put this as an aside here, was you think of Albert Einstein as being one of the smartest people in the world. And I read his book that was written by Walter Isaacson called Einstein, His Life and Universe. And a funny thing was that he essentially had to go back to school and learn a lot of math so he could turn the theory of special relativity into the theory of general relativity. And the only way he was able to produce the Einstein field equations in 1915 was for him to take the time necessary to learn the math. So he had two choices, really. He could talk to an advanced mathematician and try to get them to do the work, but they would have to understand what he's talking about. And he thought that it was easier for him to learn the math and then to implement all of that himself. So the point of this was really just that one of the smartest people in the history of the world had to work really hard to learn something new because they talk about it in the book. It was not coming easy to him, but he knew that he had to work hard to be able to come up with this theory of general relativity. So the only reason I mention that is if you do find this hard at certain points, just remember that some things are hard. And for Einstein and for me with Drupal, learning something hard can actually be very good for you sometimes. And then I want to make one more point here about point number 7, which was thinking in functional programming. And it's a bit of a different way of thinking than you would think in object-oriented programming. So basically what happens is you see an application like this. And if you've used Spark, if you've written applications in Spark, it's a lot like this. So basically you see data flowing into an application. It's being transformed by a series of pure transformer functions. And then you produce some type of output in the end. So the first lessons in this video series are aimed at helping you to think this way, to see your applications this way as a series of data flows and transformers. So I have one lesson where functional programming is like writing Unix pipelines. And we start off in that lesson with the who command, the Unix who command. So at this point, I'm assuming you know Unix or Linux. So you start off with the who command, you get that data, you pass it into wc-l, which counts the number of lines. Then use the translate command, and then you end up with the number 8 at the end in that particular example. So a key about this is just starting off with a source of data. You have this transformation function, then you have the result in the end. And again, data flows in only one direction. I'm not mutating anything over here or over here. It's just the data is flowing right from here to here to here to the end. And I never go back here and try to modify this data or this data. It's always just flowing. It's only transformed from one format to another as we go from here to here to here. And another thing you'll see as we get a little further in the book is that functional programming signatures are very important. And what I mean by that is the signatures of pure functions are very important. And I'll talk about that more in a lesson that's titled Pure Function Signatures Tell All, or something like that. I can't remember what the new title of that lesson is, but it'll be something like that. And we'll talk a lot about why pure function signatures are important. So, again, summary of the goals for this book, and these again are the soft goals: introduce functional programming in a simple, thorough way, present the solutions in a systematic way, discuss the motivation and benefits of functional programming features. I want to share several small but complete applications to show how you can organize them. I want to save you the time and effort of having to learn another programming language like Haskell, as I had to do in order to understand functional programming. And in general, I want to help you think in functional programming. And finally, I also say that it's important in this learning process to have this attitude of question everything. So, if I hadn't mentioned it already, when I first wrote this book, my metaphor for writing this book was that I was a reporter, right? I wasn't some functional programming expert. I was an object oriented programmer. I wanted to be a reporter. I was going off into this functional programming jungle, and I was keeping notes as I went through the jungle. And then I was just trying to report back to you as a reporter. And if I made it to the end of the jungle, then hopefully we would have a good book in the end. If I didn't make it to the end of the jungle, well, I guess we weren't going to have a book. So that was my metaphor, was being a reporter. And part of that for me was questioning everything as I went along and asking myself, why is this better? Or is this better? And if so, why is it better? And we'll cover that next.